Hello, this is Chuck Stull looking at the automobile crisis of 2008. So, just about a dozen years ago, there was a big spike in oil prices, and that severely depressed demand for large cars and for SUVs. Now, the big three had been following the same economic model that they had back at the end of the 20th century, where most of their profits came from big cars. And that was particularly true as the inflation adjusted price of gasoline had fallen. The big three were not effective competitors in the small car segment of the market. And so when gas prices went up, GM, Ford, and Chrysler lost sales in their most profitable vehicles. Now, shortly after that, the popping of the housing bubble and the financial crisis and recession led to a big increase in unemployment, as you can see on the left-hand graph. That severely depressed demand for all cars. Um, so with the recession, income fell, uncertainty about future job prospects fell, and the financial crisis caused credit problems, making it more difficult for consumers to get loans, more difficult for car dealers to get loans. And if we look at vehicle sales, we can see that they really tanked. Um, in 2009, domestic light trucks were down nearly 40%, and overall US vehicle sales were down over 34%. And the problem that the big three faced, that was worse than some of the transplants, is that they had huge legacy costs. Now, during the era of high profits, they had promised generous retirement benefits to their workers, and they had a large number of retired workers earning high pensions with expensive health care packages. And the car companies found they could no longer afford to pay those. So all three car companies, all three of the big three US car companies faced really big losses. General Motors lost over $18 billion and needed to borrow money from the government just to survive long enough to get to bankruptcy. Chrysler was also struggling and declared bankruptcy on April 30th, 2009, followed by General Motors declaring bankruptcy June 1st, 2009. Now, Ford was also losing money, but they had enough cash on hand to survive. They had established a large amount of credit in 2006 at low rates, and that allowed them to survive the downturn without needing a government bailout. But not true for Chrysler and General Motors. Um, the government, um, both the US and Canadian government, came to the rescue of um, these two car companies and restructured them um, in some very significant ways. If we look at General Motors, it was at its peak um, just over 60% owned by the US government and another nearly 12% by the Canadian government. Um, the United Auto Workers health plan, those health benefits that had been promised, owned nearly 20% of the new General Motors. That was sometimes called the VIBA. And the bondholders who had loaned money to General Motors got a 10% share in the new GM. The new General Motors was smaller. They were closed 17 factories. They had fewer employees. They wrote off some debt, so they had fewer liabilities. They eliminated several brands, so Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, Saab all had been GM brands, were all gone. Their employees dropped from around 90,000 to about 63,000, and they became a much smaller and more efficient company. The company issued new stock to the public in 2010, and the government, the Canadian and US governments, gradually resold some of their shares to the public, and General Motors repaid some of the government loans that had been taken out. Chrysler had some similar um, restructuring. Fiat took a 20% stake um, by providing some technology and management, and got the right to purchase more. The United Auto Workers Voluntary Employee Benefits Association, the health care portion, became majority owners, and but by 2014, Fiat had completed the merger with Chrysler, took over the entire company, and became Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, is the third of our big three. Now, there were questions back during the auto crisis: is should Chrysler even be bailed out, or should it be allowed to fail? The big concern was not the 40,000 jobs that would be lost at Chrysler, but that they might bring down some of the other suppliers, which could then cause General Motors and Ford to crash as well. Of course, it was also at a period of very high unemployment during the Great Recession, and the $6 billion to bail out Chrysler was maybe seen as a cheap bailout. General Motors, though, was so big there's no question that it was going to be bailed out. Since that time period, the U.S. Auto industry has become much, much more productive. We no longer can really think of ourselves as a industry in the United States dominated by simply three companies. We have new producers. They're just not the traditional U.S., Michigan-based American labels. But we have fewer workers producing more cars, so much, much more efficient, using and introducing new technologies. In 2015, the U.S. had record sales, and that continued. There were some slowdowns and some pricing wars that suggested that there was starting to be a little more competition amongst the different manufacturers, but overall the car companies had really recovered nicely from the economic crisis. Still some concerns about the dependence of the U.S. makers on SUVs and big trucks, that if oil prices and gasoline prices went high, that they would be really hurt again. And then there was the unexpected impact of the pandemic, and the 2020 COVID-19 virus has led to, of course, another plummet in sales, and it is too early to tell what kinds of policies may be needed for the auto industry because we are right in the middle of it right now. Thank you for listening. This has been Chuck Stell talking about the auto industry crisis from Kalamazoo College.